Kia ora everyone. This is almost everything you'll need to know about the upper limb vessels. We can see here the axillary artery, the continuation of the subclavian artery, and we saw all its branches in the earlier video. The axillary artery changes its name when it passes below the lower border of teres major, about here, and becomes the brachial artery. The brachial artery travels distally in the medial part of the arm, giving off one major branch that we need to know about, which was the deep brachial artery, which follows the radial nerve behind the humerus and supplies the posterior or extensor compartment of the arm. We don't really need to know the names of these periarticular anastomotic branches. The brachial artery carried on into the cubital fossa, where it ends by dividing into the ulnar artery and the radial artery. The ulnar artery is actually the larger of the two. It gives off the branch quite proximally, which is the common interosseous artery. It's common because it's about to split into two other interosseous arteries, the anterior and posterior interosseous arteries. The anterior interosseous artery travels down the forearm just anterior to the interosseous membrane, and the posterior interosseous artery travels in the same way posterior to the interosseous membrane. The anterior interosseous artery supplies the deep muscles of the flexor pronator anterior compartment, and the posterior interosseous artery supplies the deep muscles of the extensor supinator compartment. If we draw in some of those deep muscles of the flexor compartment, say flexor digitorum profundus and flexor pollicis longus, famously unipinnate, we can see that the ulnar artery carries on and lies on top of flexor digitorum profundus until it gets to the wrist, where it becomes relatively superficial and can be palpated. It lies just radial to the ulnar nerve, which has regained its position in the flexor compartment, which is protected by flexor carpi ulnaris. The median nerve is also at this level, more centrally, and these neurovascular structures are overlain by the flexor digitorum superficialis muscle, which we'll recall had two heads, a humero-ulnar head and a radial head with a free edge in between them. And those structures are well protected by this arrangement. This is the free edge under which the neurovascular structures pass. The radial artery descends in the forearm on the radial aspect, perhaps not bowing out quite as much as shown here, but we'll live with it. It somewhat famously travels over the muscles on the radial aspect of the forearm in a well-described procession, so initially crossing supinator, and then pronator teres, then flexor digitorum superficialis radial head, then flexor pollicis longus, then pronator quadratus here, and finally coming to lie on the palmar surface of the distal radius, where it's easily palpated. From there it crosses posteriorly and runs across the floor of the anatomical snuff box. The radial artery is the most anterior structure in the extensor compartment, so it defines the edge of the extensor compartment, so everything medial to it is in the flexor compartment, and as we said, it's overlain by the brachioradialis muscle, protected by it for much of its course. There we go. These characteristic relationships of the radial artery are, of course, described succinctly by Henry Gray in his seminal treatise Anatomy Descriptive and Surgical in 1858. Here is his lovely diagram. Here the progression of muscles beneath the radial artery. Sometimes the names have been changed to protect the innocent, and he's drawn the left arm and I drew the right arm, so these are around the wrong way. And this thing is called brachioradialis now. But apart from that, very instructive. The radial artery courses backwards around the base of the thumb through the anatomical snuff box. It gives off some dorsal branches here to the wrist and to the index finger and to the thumb. But then the artery encircles the metacarpal of the thumb and heads back palmarwards. It goes between the heads of the first dorsal interosseous and then between the heads of adductor pollicis and the palm to re-enter the palm. As it re-enters the palm, it gives off large branches. This is the princeps pollicis artery, large branch to the thumb, and this is the radialis indicis artery. The remainder of the radial artery then arches across the bases of the metacarpals. It's probably a little more proximal than what's shown here, but this arch is called the deep palmar arch. It's still relatively deep at the palm, just superficial to adductor pollicis, and the arch ends by anastomosing with the ulnar artery. The deep palmar arch so formed gives off 3 palmar metacarpal arteries. The ulnar nerve, which I'll just draw in a different colour for clarity, also gives off a dorsal branch, but then proceeds in the palm to form a superficial palmar arch, and that tends to extend more distally than the deep palmar arch, said to run at the level of the metacarpal shafts. And the loop it forms is the superficial palmar arch, and it anastomoses with the radial artery at its termination. The superficial palmar arch gives off common palmar digital arteries, and these are reinforced by the metacarpal palmar arteries of the deep arch. These quickly divide into proper palmar digital arteries to supply adjacent sides of the fingers. They also have dorsal branches which supply the dorsal aspects of the fingertips here. This little guy here doesn't seem to have a name. Both the radial and ulnar arteries also have palmar carpal branches forming a smaller palmar carpal arch, and they have vessels that supply the palmar surface of the wrist. Also getting in on the action is some branches from the anterior interosseous artery here. So really the whole band is getting back together. There's a similar but less complex arrangement on the dorsal surface. The radial arteries with its dorsal carpal branch anastomoses with the dorsal branch of the ulnar artery to form a dorsal carpal arch. Again, the interosseous artery helping out. The dorsal carpal arch gives rise to dorsal metacarpal arteries, which divide into dorsal digital arteries. These are shorter than on the palmar side because the proper palmar digital arteries supply the fingertips even dorsally. There are veins that accompany all of these arteries, the deep veins of the upper limb, and they have the same names as the arteries. As they accompany the artery, the deep veins are known as venae comitantes, and often they split into 2 pairs and spiral their way around the artery they accompany, anastomosing intermittently as they do so. There are superficial veins that do not accompany arteries. The veins of the dorsum of the hand form a dorsal venous network that gives rise to 2 named superficial veins, the cephalic vein radially and the basilic vein on the ulnar side. These course up the forearm and are joined over the cubital fossa in the antecubital region by a median cubital vein. Often there is a median antebrachial vein also that joins the median cubital. The cephalic vein continues up the lateral side of the arm and remains superficial until it reaches the deltopectoral groove, through which it passes to join the axillary vein. The basilic vein continues up the medial part of the arm, essentially overlying the brachial artery and its vena comitans, the brachial vein, and then joins the brachial vein just as it's becoming the axillary vein. That's almost everything you need to know about the vascular structures of the upper limb, the vessels. Enjoy the rest of your day. Ka kite.